Hi everyone, welcome to iNACOL's December Teacher Talk webinar. My name is Natalie Abel. I'm a program manager here at iNACOL, and I'm sure quite a few more folks are going to be trickling in, but before we get started, I would just like to go over a few housekeeping items. So today we're going to be exploring assessments and grading for teachers in K-12 competency-based systems. And we are grateful to have Juliana Charles Brown, Associate Director of the New York City Mastery Collaborative, Christy Kingham, ELA teacher at the Young Women's Leadership School of Astoria, and Megan Minturn, a dance teacher at Brooklyn International High School. And we're so grateful you could all join us today. I know everyone's super busy right before the holidays especially, so we really appreciate you taking the time to be here with us tonight, and we really encourage you to ask as many questions and be as involved as you'd like to be so that we can really all learn together. So before we get started, in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen you'll see a chat box. So if you haven't done so already, please introduce yourself. Let us know who you are, where you're tuning in from, if you're just getting started in competency ed or if you've been doing it for a while. If you have any burning questions you brought with you today, we'd love to hear it. So, and be sure to ask your questions throughout the webinar as well. So we'll pause at different points throughout and make sure that we answer those for you. And we'll save some time at the very end for Q&A as well. So today's webinar will be recorded and archived on the inacol.org website. So once we get that up there, we will send you all an email with a link to those resources so you can review them, share them with other colleagues, and remind yourselves of things you might have forgotten. So we'll make sure that you get those resources as well over the next couple days. And if you are a fan of the Twitterverse, you'll see Ashley just dropped in some handles in the chat box down there, so make sure to extend the conversation there and share what you're learning. We want our messages to go far and wide and all learn together, so be sure to do that. And without further ado, I will gladly and graciously now turn it over to Charlie to kick us off today. So Charlie, it's all you.
Hello everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today for assessments and grading for teachers in K-12 competency-based education. A rough sketch of what we're going to do today. We're going to go in three main parts. We're going to take our first 20 or so minutes to kind of define what we think of and how we think of mastery grading or competency-based grading. Then we're going to take some time to see some examples of mastery grading in action from the two teachers that are joining us today. And then finally, we're going to wrap up our conversation with a discussion of what sort of our ideals for mastery and the future of mastery and how you can take steps in your classroom to get to that ideal state. And then last but not least, we'll take some questions at the end. So we're really looking forward to getting started. I'm going to pop up our contact information briefly here for you now, but again, we're going to circle back to this at the end. So for the moment, we'll just take a few minutes to introduce ourselves. As Natalie mentioned, my name is Juliana Charles Brown. You'll probably hear my colleagues refer to me as Charlie on this webinar. I work as the Associate Director of the Mastery Collaborative here in NYC. Which is a growing community of schools who are implementing competency systems. In my work, I have the pleasure of facilitating peer-to-peer learning among some truly phenomenal educators here in New York. And in that vein, I'll be facilitating our conversation between some educators today. And without further ado, I will let those educators introduce themselves to you. Christy, why don't you kick it off for us?
Hi everyone, I'm Christy Kingham. It's such a pleasure to be here. I am, as previously mentioned as well, I'm a 11th grade English teacher at the Young Women's Leadership School of Astoria. This is a school that is a 6th through 12th grade school, and it is all girls and public in the New York City system. And we're part of a network of all girls schools, young women's leadership schools, and there are 4 other schools in the city. And we have been doing mastery-based grading for the past 7 years at our school, and you'll get to hear a lot more about that. I should also add that I'm a peer collaborative teacher, which is an instructional coach or lead teacher, and the title that we have in the DOE.
And hello, my name is Megan. I teach dance at the Brooklyn International High School. And like Twills and Astoria, the Brooklyn International High School is a public Department of Education school. We're a high school serving 9th through 12th graders and specifically work with English language learners. We have students from over 30 different countries who speak over 50 different languages, and we use a lot of project-based learning to engage students and prepare them for college and careers. We've been using Mastery for about 3 years now. We did a pilot 3 years ago, and just this year, our entire school is using Mastery for the first time.
Thanks, guys, so much. I want to kick it off by talking a little bit about, giving a little bit more information about the context that we're here in New York. In INACOL's Promising State Policies for Personalized Learning, New York State received an emerging rating for personalized learning opportunities. And what that means for us is that we've seen over the past few years growing opportunities for personalization in graduation requirements, namely in the area of our culminating exams, which we call the Regents exams here. So those are 5 exams that students have to pass to get out of high school. And in 2015, there was flexibility there was some legislation passed that gave flexibility for students to select in their 5th exam an area of interest to them. So rather than taking a second history exam, they had the flexibility to take humanities, STEM, CTE, arts, or a biliteracy pathway. So what we see here in New York State is that things are sort of moving in the direction of personalized learning, but not quite at the level of certain states where you have competency-based education that's being legislated at the state level, like a Rhode Island. And when we drill down into New York City, what we're talking about is the largest urban school district in the country. We're serving 1.1 million students in about 1,800 schools. And what that means for innovation is that we actually have a real opportunity because of the size of the district. We really have kind of this fertile ground for exploration of new ideas. Individual schools have a lot of autonomy. So long as they're sort of working within the confines of state, city, and union policy, individual schools can really make a lot of decisions about what they want their school to run like. And so for innovation and implementation, that means that we see sort of like many different subtle iterations of implementation of the same innovation, which has kind of really been nice for us as we've watched competency emerge here in New York City. So the New York City Mastery Collaborative is the organization of which I'm the associate director. We are a community of 40 public middle and high schools that are in some stage of transition to competency-based education, right from sort of the very beginning pilot stages up to like Twills and Brooklyn International schools that have been doing it for years now. And the way that we work is we engage in peer-to-peer learning, because what we realized is that we had 40-plus schools that were implementing this really sort of challenging task in relative isolation in these sort of silos. And so what we do in the Mastery Collaborative is kind of bring people together to learn from each other and share resources. And if you'd like to hear more about our work, please check out our website down there at the bottom of this slide, or get in touch with me after the session. Now we can dive right into the content of our session for today. So, there are a lot of different ways to kind of think about mastery grading. We've kind of framed our discussion today along these three dimensions, these sort of fundamental pieces of school that mastery grading shifts. The first of these is the learning goals, or the actual what is being taught. What are the skills and knowledge that we want students to leave us with when they go to their post-secondary life? The next piece is, how do we get students to that learning goal? How does mastery or competency fundamentally change the way that students move towards learning goals and that teachers teach towards learning goals? And then finally, the subject, or the main subject of the webinar today is how that learning is measured and how that measurement is communicated to our students. So let's jump right in. At this point, we'll dive a little bit deeper into learning goals. So in traditional grading, learning goals, or at least what gets measured, are typically some sort of combination of content acquisition and compliance factors. What we mean when we say compliance factors is we mean that the behaviors that are often expected without being developed and say little about what a student actually knows and can do. A few classic examples of these are attendance, homework, or classwork completion, and the ever-fuzzy participation grade. One of the biggest shifts in a competency framework is the shift in these learning goals. So now I want to turn to our teachers and ask, how are learning goals, also known as competencies, outcomes, proficiencies, or learning targets, articulated differently in a mastery school versus a traditional school?
So I can start. This is Christy. So one of the biggest differences between a mastery school, actually, I'm going to pause for a second because I know that in most of the country, people refer to mastery as competency. So I just want to say that again, that when we're talking about mastery in New York City, it is the same thing as competency or outcomes. We often have this semantics problem, but I'm going to tie back in, but I just wanted to mention that. So the way that these outcomes are articulated differently is it's skill-based, and instead of planning a course around content, we're planning our courses around skills, and the content of those skills live in the assignments, or what at my school we call the evidence of mastery. So instead of having a grade on a project that asks a student to, so let's say like an earth science lab, for example, where a student is talking about different types of rocks, and pardon me, I'm an English teacher, but so they're trying to discover which rocks they have in front of them. Instead of it being about the types of rocks, their assessment will be about the skills that they need to be able to access to discern which rocks are which. So that's just a simple example, but that's one way to think about the difference.
Yeah, hi, this is Megan. I completely agree with both what Christy and Charlie said, just about in terms of really finding the greatest takeaway that we want students to have from our classes and making our assessment and grading align with that. I think that as teachers, we always have our aim and our goals and our outcomes, but our traditional grade book model often values things like participation or completing homework without necessarily having students make a clear connection between what that homework or participation grade really means. So sort of a shift that I see in using mastery is that we make it so clear for our students when we articulate our standards or our learning objectives, like Christy said, whatever the semantics may be, but making the goals of our course very transparent for students, and then also allowing them to see their growth over time. Learning management systems have done wonders in making that something that we can track and also make very visual to students. But for a student to be able to see where they were at the beginning of the year on one standard, and then hopefully a sort of depth and understanding toward the end of the year can be really empowering. Something we also talk about at the Brooklyn International High School is teaching and making explicit our college, career, and life skills. So the idea that if a student goes into an interview, they can talk about their ability to collaborate and think creatively and articulate some of the skills that they have honed over the time of their high school. So I really appreciate the idea of allowing our grading system to encourage students to see their own strengths.
And one of the things, since you mentioned your college, career, and life skills goals, that I think is such a great shift in learning goals, when we move away from these sort of compliance metrics like homework completion or like participation, and we replace it with something like college career standards and something like what TWILS uses, which is the plan outcome. It's actually a skill that can be learned and then is taught, rather than something that's just sort of this background set of expectations about how you as a student are supposed to behave. So how guys does this change your teaching practice? When you're in the classroom, how does this shift in the learning goals change the way that you kind of see your curriculum?
Well, it completely changes everything from your year-long plan to your unit plan to your lesson planning. And as a teacher, you're thinking about the skills in your course across a year, a semester, a project. So your planning becomes about teaching into the transference of that skill, and the content is folded in. And so as they master the skills, they become more adept at retaining and using content and critically thinking about the content, whatever that content might be. Yeah, so that's the biggest shift in your teaching for me.
Excellent. Yeah, I see that shift also. Something that has been helpful for me with Mastery is the ability for me to, as a teacher, to really reflect on what it is that I'm teaching and how it is I'm teaching that goal or that standard. One of my standards is the idea of an artist's purpose or focus in their choreographic works. And after my first year, I realized I had only provided students about 3 different projects in which they were really being taught and assessed on that specific standard. So it was really sort of an enlightening moment for me to sit back and say, oh, this thing that I really value, how much am I actually making that explicit to students? And something we've been doing on our curriculum maps as we share at the Brooklyn International High School is that we are aligning projects to our standards. So we're able to see how many opportunities are we giving students to practice their analysis of evidence, or how many opportunities are we giving students to make a claim, whatever the standard may be. I think that there's a reflective element of standards-based grading in teaching that it is really informative of our practice.
So wonderful. So just to review, learning goals in a competency or mastery environment become more upfront and transparent for students. They shift fundamentally towards a lens on skills and transferable skills. Because of that, they become more relevant to students. And then that completely flips the teaching practice, where content becomes delivered as evidence that skills are being learned. So I think now that we have this idea that fundamentally the goal or what we want students to know is shifting towards this fundamentally different thing. The necessary question is, how does progression towards that goal change? How do students learn differently, and how do teachers teach differently? Because in our traditional school, we have time as our main organizational unit. Students are given a particular amount of time to acquire a particular amount of content, and then when the assessment comes at a particular time, the grade reflects the amount of content that the student was able to get in that time. And so when we sort of de-emphasize this time element and replace it with learning goals, what happens to teaching and learning for you guys?
Sorry about that. Megan, go ahead.
Oh, thanks, Chrissy. Sorry. I really appreciate this sort of spiraled image, the image of the spiral. It reminds me of some of Jerome Bruner's theories on learning, and that idea that we need multiple iterations in order to grow in our understanding, in order to grow in our critical thinking, and that idea that throughout a course, like we talked about before, just returning to skills, and then like Christy said, looking at skills more than content, and what are students doing with the content, how are they processing it, how are they creating, and then I think that also serves itself well. This idea of multiple iterations, a spiraled sense of learning, serves itself well in my situation at my school with a very heterogeneous environment. We're an international school, and we have students of different English proficiencies, different levels of schooling, students who had delayed education in their native countries and are new to school, and then students who also had a very strong educational background and are focusing more on learning English. So something that I found with Mastery is that I'm able to offer different entrance points into the learning, and then also different scaffolds for different students who might need different things, yet that the community, the classroom community, is connected through the project. So I think that it's two things for me that are really important that Mastery allows, is sort of a shift in teaching so that I'm concerned mostly about the skill, mostly about the greater takeaway and understanding, and then that I'm also able to meet students really where they are and provide them multiple opportunities to continue forward.
Thank you, Megan. That was beautifully put. I wanted to add to what you said. I think the multiple opportunities piece in regards to time is really important to think about, because if you're giving a student opportunity for mastery and they are not yet meeting that standard, then you're going to give them another opportunity. And you might think, well, in a traditional setting, how do you do that when time does exist? You know, it's not like we can just have students in our courses for years. But what you do is you move on to another piece of content, and so you can leave that other content behind. It doesn't matter in that moment if they have accessed that content or not. And it's not to say, oh, the content doesn't matter. It doesn't matter at that time. If the student is working on building their skills, they're going to be able to access that content again later on. So for me, the way that works at Tools of Astoria is you're working on a skill in the fall, and a student, we call it not yet meeting standards, if they have not yet met the standard, and then they're meeting standards if they're meeting it, and exceeding if they've surpassed the standard. And the idea is if they're not yet, it doesn't mean that they're going to fail the course. It's rather, it's your job as an educator to give them multiple opportunities to work on that skill. And so then if we were reading The Bluest Eye in the fall, and they weren't able to achieve the standards of skills that we are working on, it doesn't mean that they're going to fail the course. It just means that they're not yet meeting, and then they're going to have another opportunity. So for me, that's like a really huge shift in your teaching as well, is also letting go and knowing that the content isn't as important as the skills. The student needs the skills to be able to access the content.
Fantastic. So just to review, when time is removed, our learning goals replace time as a kind of trade. Our students can access the material at different times and with different content because they're focusing on their skills. And their assessments are not the moment where learning stops and labels are handed out. Okay, so to the big question of the day is assessment and grading. How do you guys know when a student has mastered something?
For me, at our school, it's multiple demonstrations of mastery across many different pieces of evidence or assignments. So that transfer skill, that's part of understanding by design. We do subscribe to that idea. That true mastery is shown when you can transfer a skill through multiple modalities. And we do use benchmark kind of standards. We use the Common Core standards. We use 21st century competencies. We use basically anything that's out there that has, is research based about quote unquote grade level, and we usually try to do it in bands so that we're looking across a few grades at once for us to come up with shared rubrics. So at our school we have rubrics that are spiraled from 6th grade to 12th grade for each of our skills.
Yeah, I really liked what you said about demonstrating a skill in different settings and at different times. At the Brooklyn International High School, we use portfolios and as a performance-based assessment. So prior to graduating, a student will present a project in math, in science, in art, in English, history, and then they'll be on a panel with a team of teachers in which they present their work, and then teachers also are able to ask them more about their project and their learning. And really, during the conversation, it's a time of sharing what they've learned, but also the conversation itself is a learning moment. And prior to that conversation, teachers work to norm the rubrics and have a shared understanding of what it means to meet a standard. And then also those rubrics are shared across across our consortium or a group of schools that uses a similar rubric. So I think that it's an interesting idea because something I'm also interested in is the idea that learning doesn't finish after high school, and that really any standard that I think would be worthwhile is something that you could put your life into learning. If it's a larger skill that we want students to have, hopefully they'll continue investing time and interest and a sense of inquiry into what we're teaching them. So I think it's interesting, just the terminology of having mastered something. Yes, definitely, and that's what we lead them to, and then also we lead them to hopefully continuing that.
Fantastic. And when you're assessing for mastery, what types of assessments I hear that you use portfolio and performance assessments at Brooklyn International, and it sounds like both of you are using rubrics to assess for mastery. Now, how does all of that sort of filter down when you're generating grades, and how do grades work in your classroom?
So our grades at 12 of Astoria are given on pieces of evidence. I use that word often, so otherwise known as assignments. But we use evidence because that's pretty broad. So an observation of a Socratic seminar class discussion, a performance, a traditional assignment. So you could have like an on-demand assessment, or basically any evidence that you see of them demonstrating that they can do that skill, or that they're exceeding or that they are not yet doing that skill. And that sounds kind of overwhelming when you think about it, but it actually isn't. It opens you up as a teacher to be able to consider your course space differently. Sometimes I will assess students right in the moment and give them that quick feedback with a rubric, and then they adjust, and then we try it again. So it works in many different ways, and that just gets back to the multiple opportunity piece. Also, in regards, just sorry to finish, for us, we have it's the most recent evidence that we consider. We do look at the breadth of their evidence, but in terms of, we're an annualized school, so in terms of giving them a current rating on that skill, we're looking at the past 3 or 4 pieces of evidence to try to assess where they are in this moment.
We're also annualized in our grading, and we use jump rope as a learning management system, so students are able to, and parents and families are able to check their work and their grades throughout the year. But we do look at the most recent grade and hold that as the most weight.
Fantastic. So just to quickly review before we move on to our next section, achieving mastery means that a skill has been demonstrated multiple times across multiple types of assessments or modalities. You all are using project, performance, and portfolio-based assessments, upfront and transparency rubrics, and multiple opportunities to demonstrate skill acquisition. And in your grading, the grades are given on the skills rather than the content. I heard Christy talking about non-traditional marks, not yet meeting and exceeding standards. And I also heard both of you talking about something that in jump rope is called the power law, where later assessments may be counted more sort of heavily than earlier assessments. And in all cases, multiple forms of assessment are used in different contexts. Does anybody have any question from the audience, or shall we move on right to our next section?
Charlie, we did see a few questions come through, and first of all, I'd like to say, great job in the chat box, everyone. There's lots of great sharing and resources being shared down there. That's really fantastic. So one of the first questions is on your rubric on, a few slides ago when you talked about assessment and grading. What is the difference between exceeding standards and above standards?
You can click back to that rubric if it's helpful.
Oh, sure. So
yep, right there.
Above standards we use as, and because we're often, all of these are tied to projects, so sometimes it will be very specific to the project, but often we teach that exceeding standards goes beyond what was taught in class, and that for seniors, exceeding standards is really doing college level work. And I also want to say that these, I saw in the chat box a little bit asking about the words, something in terms of like approaching, meeting, above, exceeding. We worked to align with the Department of Education. So the school district already had a mastery-based scale that we could adapt. So by using this scale, we're able on students' report cards to have, we don't change into a letter grade. Sometimes with mastery, people are able to use mastery in their class, but then at the end of the year, they'll receive an A, B, C, D. So we decided that we preferred to use the Department of Education's existing grading scale to allow the feedback that students receive in class to match that which will be on their transcript, just in hopes of transparency. And the way that we teach it for students is that exceeding standards is going beyond what we've done in class, and that at the 12th grade level, really they're doing college level work.
And what happens if a student doesn't meet the standard in your classroom?
We work to give multiple opportunities, so hopefully they will, and then if that isn't happening through the normal projects or different opportunities that we provide, then they have the option to do different classes in the summer or get different support from staff within school. I think a lot of times when a student isn't meeting standards, it's an opportunity for us to create new avenues, and also as a sign that a student might need additional support as opposed to just what they're getting in class.
Okay, and one more question before we move to the next section here. Lisa Adams asked, how many times must a student demonstrate a certain skill before it is deemed mastered?
Megan, go ahead.
Go ahead, Christy.
So you may have noticed for both of us, we had a pretty small amount of learning targets or outcomes, and that's on purpose for us. And of course, a year-long course, there are 15 targets maximum, outcome targets, and that is so that they have to be big enough to allow for. I mean, the very minimum would be in a year-long course would be 6 times. Depending on if it's like a skill that is, like I've seen 4 as the least amount, and then I've seen as much as 20 different times that it's been assessed, and that's at the teacher's discretion in regards to the exact number, and that's because however your project lends itself or what the students need may be different, but that the target has enough breadth that it can be returned to again and again and again throughout the year, and then finally assessed at the end.
And I'll also say that this is something that it kind of varies. This is one of those places where, because we in New York City get to see so many different iterations of this implementation, we can see that this is something that just has to be determined based on your school's philosophy of what it means to master something. So does it mean to demonstrate it 3 times? Does it mean to demonstrate it with progressively more difficult content? Does it mean 4 times in 2 different modalities? I think it's one of those things that just becomes reflective of your school's definition or your district or whatever the case may be, definition of what mastery is. I think at this point we'll go on to the next section. For this part of the webinar, we're going to see 2 examples of mastery grading in action. So first, Christy is going to take us through her My POV unit and talk about the assessments and grading that she did there. And then Megan is going to do the same with her water unit. So for now, I'll turn it over to Christy.
Excellent. Thank you, Charlie. So in my 11th grade ELA course, we have a pretty big unit that I do in the spring, and I call it My POV, for my point of view. And the way that came about was when I moved from middle school to high school about 6 years ago, realizing that my students needed to write the highest stakes piece of writing they would ever do in high school, which is the college essay. And planning backwards with that in mind, how could I provide multiple opportunities for them to do that type of work with the skills and the content that I was thinking about. So knowing that that was my end product, I planned in a project-based way what were the experiences that I could give them along the way. So that's the very first, the background of the unit. And what I realized is that college essay is nothing more than a really well-written piece of narrative nonfiction. And so I expanded our work to be a study of narrative nonfiction and transferring our study to the writing of our college essays. So that came from a content-y place, and knowing that I have a year-long outcomes that I use, which are, sorry, it's my first time, there it is. I have these year-long outcomes that I'm using and thinking about the ones I wanted to start with for this course and what I had already done with them and what was coming. You can see I knew I would be using arguing, discerning, creating, being precise, collaborating, communicating, and planning. And that there are multiple outcome targets for some of my larger buckets. And I should mention that these larger buckets are 21st century skills that every single course in our school teaches. The targets to the right that you see are the more discrete skills that each content area has. So for this case, I was starting in this place and thinking, okay, these are the skills, the learning goals for my POV. And so planning backwards, what type of evidence would I want to have my students attempt to show their mastery in this way? And I obviously have their college essay, and then I was thinking about other ways to have them interact with narrative nonfiction. And they do a study of narrative nonfiction through James McBride's The Color of Water, and then there's about 20 shorter pieces, and they have to select 5 or 6 from that. And they also have to read an independent memoir. And throughout that, I create some deliverables for them. So in building the evidence, I'm thinking about those different learning goals. How could I have different types of opportunities for them to practice their communication, to practice their collaboration? So it becomes things like having whole class discussions around our shared text that we're reading, and that's collaborating and arguing. And then they created a narrative nonfiction scrapbook, which demonstrates their discernment and their analysis, studying the genre, which is our create outcome. So I'll show you on the next slide. So what I do when I'm thinking about this is, and Megan mentioned this before, I want to make sure that I have all these outcome targets. I lay out my evidence that I'm thinking about to make sure that I'm giving them enough opportunity, and knowing where we are at this point in the year and looking back at my work, what would be the most fruitful opportunities for them and what type of evidence makes the most sense. Also always considering my end game, which is for them to have a killer college essay. So this is the type of table that I do for every single unit at the beginning when I'm doing my planning. Sorry for the pause. So one other just quick zoom in I wanted to do is the way that we actually grade. We do have shared rubrics, as I mentioned prior, and so I just put 2 examples. One is for The Color of Water class reading and on-demand discussions that we would have. You can see I have them discerning and communicating. And then to the right you see NY, MS, and ES. And the NY is our not yet that I mentioned prior. MS is meeting standards, ES is exceeding standards. And so the students receive their rubrics prior to, actually they receive everything at the beginning of the unit, and then we just keep referring back to it. And I have them annotate their rubrics, and we do that every time we have work together, even though our rubrics stay the same for every assignment, and they have some particularities that may come up for them. So on the bottom you see this I believe essay. Similarly, you can see 2 different outcomes, creating and being precise, and then the criteria to the right. So I mentioned that the rubrics are the same for every piece of evidence, And that is the same throughout our whole humanities department. So when a student goes to their social studies teacher or their arts teacher, they see similar rubrics. And that shared language isn't something we've talked about yet, but at our school it is an incredible piece. So that when students come to me, we can talk about what they're doing in their other classes and we have the same exact language that we're using. This is a unit that I'm still always working on, and oh, Charlie, are you supposed to be asking me these questions?
I mean, I think we can see them, but maybe for the interest of time, we can just ask you to reflect on this unit.
Sure. I'm actually really excited to do this unit again because since last year, we have refined our rubrics across our humanities department, and it's making me think about my evidence a little bit differently in the breadth of my year. So now we'll have had 3/4 of a year with more refined rubrics, and I'm going to relook at the evidence and consider there might be some gaps in some areas for me to provide more opportunities for students to keep working on those skills.
Great. Thank you.
So that is that.
Thank you so much, Christy. And now, Megan, we'll ask you to tell us a little bit about your Mastery Grading in Action and the Water Unit.
Sure. In the Water Unit, this was an interdisciplinary portfolio project that 9th and 10th grade students were doing. You spoke a little bit about time earlier, and for 2 weeks we suspend time and no longer have our usual hour and 5-minute classes, but students have 2 weeks to really prepare their learning and work collaboratively to prepare for a portfolio project where they'll present and discuss their learning with teachers. So I'm on an interdisciplinary team that has a science teacher, math teacher, English teacher, history teacher, and then I'm the dance teacher on the team. And we work to find a shared project that we can all then approach through the lenses of our different disciplines. So for our 9th and 10th graders, we were looking at water. In the history class, they were looking at stormwater in New York City and things like permeable pavement. In math class, they were looking at access to clean water. In their English class, they were looking at poetry inspired by water. In science, they were looking at water quality and conducting water quality labs. And then in dance, we were looking at celebrated choreographers. So while our portfolios have a shared thematic or content lens, then within our specific content areas, we all have our own unique standards that we're working to address. So students looked at Doris Humphrey's water study, Alvin Ailey's Wade in the Water from Revelations, and Bill T. Jones' D-Man in the Waters, so considering how water could be symbolic, and then also how water could be used symbolically in dance, and then also in conjunction with the other classes, each group chose an area around water of advocacy, something that they were hoping to advocate for concerning water, and then they created stop motion videos, PSAs, poetry, and dances around that issue. So I think it's just interesting to think about sort of the ability, even within a typical bell schedule and brick and mortar school building, ways that we can creatively use time, and it's something that our school frequently does. So in the water unit, I work, again, along standards, and I have standards that are related to the New York City Department of Education blueprint for the arts, and then that in turn is also related to the National Core Art Standards. So I adapt the standards to be student-facing and student-friendly for English language learners, but also have it aligned to state and national dance standards. and art standards. So through this process, they were working on collaboration, and that's a college career and life standard that is present throughout all disciplines and courses in the school. And then performing and choreographing are unique to my content and class. Through performing, they were learning a little bit of Lemon's fall and release technique, and then through choreographing, they were specifically working on the idea of motif. So I'll just advance here. So in order to do this, at the beginning, students were working, as I said, to study existing works, and part of that also allowed students to enter the learning at different places. When reading articles about famous choreographers or writing responsive essays, I provide different reading options and questions so that students can select one that's appropriate for their level, and then that often, of course, advances over the course of the year, which is fun to see as students improve. And then also part of mastery and good teaching in general is just the ability for students to consider where they are and assess themselves and assess one another's. I find that the language of mastery and being very explicit about the skills allows students to have very candid discussions with one another about their work, and then also create an analysis of their own work. Then they work in groups, as I mentioned, to create a piece around an issue that they were hoping to advocate for, and then performed those for a team of teachers that then had a discussion about the choices that they made, their learning process, and it's an opportunity for students to delve into discussing their work. This is an example of a rubric, and something in contrast to what Christy was saying. While the standards are the same for me throughout projects, the rubrics sometimes change. Like specifically, I mentioned that in this project I was specifically looking at motif, but that isn't necessarily true in every choreographic task. So that's just one, I guess, sort of difference in how mastery is rolled out in different schools. This you can see it's in the eye, so I was requesting that students do a little bit of self-reflection, and then I also gave them feedback. Peers gave them feedback. So multiple opportunities for feedback and discussion. And then in terms of what worked well in the unit, I think in the unit and then also in mastery in general, for me, has been being able to collaborate with colleagues in creating rubrics and in discussing student work. I feel like the opportunity for students to be able to perform and then have an academic discussion with teachers is invaluable, because students are describing their work and then also really getting immediate feedback about where they are in their learning process and where they can go next. So I feel grateful to be in a place where rubric creation, student work discussion is a collaborative work, and something that we look at how can we give students opportunities to excel and move forward.
That's amazing. Thank you so much, Megan. Do you have any other conclusions on your water unit that you'd like to share before we move on?
No, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm going just to move past questions really quick because we're getting close to time now, and I want to make sure that we have just a few minutes at the end here to talk about sort of this idea of the mastery grading dream state, which is this thing that we see in mastery implementation often, where there's this sort of ideal that we're trying to move towards, but there are barriers in the way for whatever reason. Maybe it's that you're working in a school that's not ready to make the shifts you're ready to make, or a district, or there's a policy constraint. But we wanted to sort of open up a conversation about the things you can do to move towards these mastery ideals. So the ones that we kind of wanted to touch on today are the shift away from traditional grades, creating consistency, and personalized pacing in classroom communities. I think in the interest of time, maybe Natalie, what we can do is we can ask the chat room which of those three seems like the most hot button issue. I'm seeing Ken says the third. Anybody else? All right, let's move on to personalized pacing. The pacing is personalized while classrooms also maintain a sense of collaboration and community. And I think this is a question that we get in schools all the time. There's this fear that if the pendulum swings too far in the direction of asynchronicity, that students will sort of lose that that sense of community and moving along and progressing with their classmates. And what do you think? How do you guys handle that at your schools, Christy and Megan?
Excuse me. So the way that we handle that is by providing multiple entry points for students, but having shared experiences. So often if you're working in a workshop, it's sort of like a classic workshop for a writing workshop, and you're all working at different paces, but you may pause and have critique sessions, and there's protocol around that helps to build community. So building in those shared experiences regardless of where students are at is pretty essential. Yeah. And also we ask big questions of the students when they have the same question to ponder. It just might be that they're accessing it in different ways or at different times.
And I think another strategy that we see is that when people are defining their highest performance level, or we got a question earlier about what it means to exceed mastery. We have some schools in the collaborative that take that highest performance level and they make it such that in order to achieve that, you have to be able to teach your classmates or somebody who maybe is struggling with that particular skill in order to achieve the highest level of performance.
I will just say too about exceeding. I just popped over to the room and I saw a pretty interesting debate about using the word exceeding and some philosophy around that, and I totally appreciate it. And this is an imperfect business for sure. But one of the ways that we think about exceeding standards, you're never done, and Megan mentioned this earlier, and that's where transference comes in. Once you're exceeding something, it doesn't mean you stop. It means you're ready to try a more challenging way of accessing that skill or applying that skill, depending on the context. So that's how we think about it. And certainly the teaching of the skill to another student is ultimate transference. But I do always, sometimes with that, I worry that it becomes a little bit of a trap for the student if you're just reteaching the skill that you've learned rather than getting new material to challenge you in the skill. It may not be pushing you even further.
A lot of teachers at the Brooklyn International High School use layered curriculum so that students, for the different, meeting above and exceeding standards, there are multiple projects that allow students to work at that level, and then students choose. So there might be 4 or 5 different projects that a student could do to demonstrate a skill, but that students have choice.
I love that. Should we move to a sort of wider Q&A at this point where we're at time pretty much now. Should we see if there are any questions as we wrap up before we finish the session?
Yeah, Charlie, there were so many great questions that came in today, and I'm sorry we just ran out of time. I will ask one question that we see all the time come through. Do you translate your competencies into letter grades at some point? You know, it still seems like it's essential in some circumstances, so we have some folks wondering how you handle that.
I think this is probably one of the hottest topics of conversation that we have sort of swirling around in the schools that we visit. So I'm very interested to hear what our teachers have to say about this.
So I'll say a couple of things. A few years back, we started investigating by reaching out to college admissions counselors to find out what they receive and how they feel about receiving a mastery-based kind of a transcript. And their answer was pretty much across the board that they receive so many different types of transcripts that as long as they have an explanation that seems pedagogically sound, that goes along with whatever the transcript is, it doesn't make a huge difference to them. And so I know that that's always a concern for folks, but that is what we found. We still, however, have we convert at the end of the year, we convert the grade to a number grade for the students. Like what Megan was saying, how they use what the city has for approaching standards, meeting standards, exceeding standards. I'm sorry, I don't remember all of them, Megan. So there are a few different options that we have in New York City in terms of grade reporting. But at my school, there is still a transfer to using a formula that I do not know how to explain. I look at it and I don't understand it, but it makes sense in terms of when a student is mastering, they're in like the mid-80 range and so on. But the way that we address that is the language that we speak at our school is the language of mastery. We do not talk about numbers. We do talk about at the end of the year and throughout the year, we do talk about the fact that the students will see a number and what that means, and that we're still reporting these grades in this way because we have not transferred to reporting in mastery yet in the wide way, but we would absolutely prefer to do that, and that regardless of any perceived implications for college. Hope that Charlie was covered what we had talked about too.
Yes, it does, and I think that the college piece is definitely the sort of first line of defense that traditional grades have, because people think that it's so sort of widely necessary to get into college. I will say that for students who don't do well on traditional standard assessments, so I'm thinking about our ELL population in New York City, it can be difficult when they also have sort of a non-traditional transcript, and I know that's a thing that really is a point of advocacy for our schools that are working with high L populations, because those standard assessments, because they are given in English, can be sort of the grades are really the place where those students shine, and their schoolwork is where they really shine. And so it's very important for those schools to communicate to colleges just how rigorous the work is. So I think that that's sort of where that fear of making the full transition into non-traditional grades comes from.
Excellent. Thank you guys so much. I'm going to forward the slide here to your contact information. We did not have time to even begin to answer all these questions. Joy Nolan, you've been great in the chat box trying to answer them frantically, so thank you for that. But I encourage you guys to reach out to one another, ask these burning questions, learn together. The chat box has been really, really beneficial in this webinar. So again, we'll be sure to send out a link to the archived version of this, and you'll be able to download and access the slides as well. And a huge thank you to our presenters today. You guys were wonderful. What a wealth of information. You guys are, I can say firsthand, they are doing amazing things in New York City. They're just absolutely fantastic up there. So thank you very, very much again. Sorry we stole 5 extra minutes of your time tonight, and I really do appreciate it. And we hope to see you all in future iNACOL webinars.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you.